So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Broadview's National Online Reading Club. My name is Emma Prestwich, and I'm Broadview's Digital and United Church and Focus Editor. Working behind the scenes to help me out is Aisha Habib, who is Broadview's Associate Editor. Aisha, do you want to wave? Awesome.
Hi, everyone.
We're so glad that you've taken an hour out of your evening to be here with us. I'm speaking to you tonight from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, the original owners and custodians of this land. Today, Toronto is home to many, including a diverse urban Indigenous community of Inuit, First Nations, and Métis. We'd love to know who you are and where you're from, so please say hello from your hometown in the chat space, as well as the traditional territory that you're on, if you happen to know that. And if you're part of a faith community and want to add that as well, please do so. So a few notes before we get started. For those of you who haven't joined us before, I want you to know that we're recording this session so we can share this event with others. If you're at all uncomfortable with your video appearing on this recording, please turn off your video now. And also please mute your audio unless you're asking a question to one of our guests, or we may mute it for you. And I think that's it. Our chat will be where we'll be asking questions, and that's the time of the event that's for you. So hoping that we have lots of questions here tonight. We're going to hear this evening from Ryan Cragun, Pieta Woolley, and Samuel Dunsiger, all of whom were featured in or contributed to the July-August 2024 issue of Broadview. So Aisha will post instructions on how to ask questions in our chat space. I have some questions ready for our guests, but this is your time, and we'll have a more vibrant conversation if there's lots of participation. So if you do have questions when it comes to the Q&A portion, you can either say, I have a question. You can, put that into the chat, and then I'll call on you, and you can come on screen and ask one of our guests. Or if you'd prefer, you can just paste your question into the chat space itself, and I'll ask it for you. So let's get started. So Ryan is our first guest. Ryan Cragun is a sociologist at the University of Tampa who researches the non-religious as well as Mormonism. Julie McGonigal interviewed Ryan about his work with the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project in the July-August feature story, Meet the Nuns. Please welcome Ryan.
There we go. Thank you so much for having me. Maybe a little bit more background on me, and then I can try and answer some of the questions. Then I'm happy to take whatever questions are coming in. Looks like we already have, maybe some questions. But Emma mentioned I study Mormons and the non-religious. Those are kind of my two areas. I am part of a very large project that is funded by the Canadian government, basically, right? It's a 7-country, though this survey is actually 8-country project. So we have participation from a variety of countries around the world, 2 from the global, well, kind of from the global south. So Argentina and Brazil, we also have Australia. For this survey project, which was a big part of this, we have survey data from Finland and Norway, also the UK, Australia, and Canada, and the US, and I'm kind of the US representative on the team. So we have primary investigators in all of those places, and the survey is just one part of this. We're also doing interviews. We've done lots of interviews with people who have left religion, raised without religion. We're really interested in kind of what is this non-religion thing that seems to be growing, and we've been gathering data from a lot of different perspectives to try and answer a number of questions that we have. Some of the questions that I was given to kind of trying to answer in advance, so I'll just mention these, and then hopefully people will have lots of questions for me. One of the questions is, what interests you most about the societal move away from religion? And I'm actually going to tie that into the last question, which is, what do you still not know? One question that I think is actually really interesting is, as people leave religion, they have some free time. Right? So they're not going to be going to church services as much. We actually know that in the data. So one of the things that really interests me is what they do with their time. So how do they spend their time? We have a little bit of data on that. I actually have data from another study in a book that's coming out where I do address this at length, but I think it's an interesting question. We're also interested in 2 other, I think, really important questions. And I don't know that we have all the answers to this at this point. We're still early in the research. But one is, how do they make moral and ethical decisions? So I think that's a really interesting question. I know we have some other people who are part of that story, so they may be able to help answer this. And then the last one is a very broad and kind of strange question, but it's how do they understand the world, the natural world, the world around them, and their place in that world? Again, we have some initial answers from a lot of the research that we're doing, but we don't have all the answers. So those are some of the things that really, really interest me. And that's part of why I'm really interested in the societal move away from religion. And we still don't know the answers to all of those. And then some things that we didn't talk about, we actually have loads and loads of data. We just scratched the surface with our interviews. So happy to try and answer any questions. I don't know if I covered everything that you wanted me to cover, Emma, or if you have specific questions that you want me to cover, but I'm happy to take questions. I love doing this. And I actually have the data set up if people have questions about our survey data or anything else.
Oh, that's fantastic, Ryan. Thanks so much. I mean, I have a ton of questions. I'm sure folks do as well, but I'll get it started while people spend some time thinking of them. I know it sometimes takes some time being on the subject matter to come up with something. So I know there are a variety of answers to this, and depending on the angle that you come at the research from, you might answer it differently. What is your sense of what is driving this trend away from religion and towards identifying as non-religious?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we are starting to get pretty good answers, and I'm not trying to shill for my book. I'm not even going to mention the name of it, but in in a book that I have coming out in October, we frame this as something similar to immigration. So I mean, I'm kind of trained in demography, but I'm not. I don't really identify as a demographer. But when we think about immigration, there are always factors that are pushing people away from a country, and there are factors that are pulling people towards a country, right? So maybe there's a lack of jobs in the home country, but there are more job opportunities in the receiving country. So those would be what we call push and pull factors. And the way that we're starting to think about people leaving religion is that it's a combination of those. So it's not just one factor. It's actually kind of complicated, that there are factors pushing people out of religion, and then there are factors pulling people towards non-religion. And I can mention just a couple of these. Some of them may not make sense for every religion, right? So these are, again, just like broad level factors. But one of the factors that we know is actually really important in the US, but in other countries as well, is a lot of religions' positions on things like LGBTQ plus equality, right? So if you're a very conservative religion and your position is that like lesbian and gay individuals are not allowed a position in here, transgender individuals don't even exist, right? If you're taking those kinds of positions, for a lot of young people, this just does not fit with their ethical and moral understanding of the world. So we would consider that a push factor that's pushing people out. So I'm just mentioning one. There are actually lots, right? So I could go through a whole bunch, but I'm going to kind of keep it simple. On the pull side, there's a factor that I like to call just autonomy. So you actually have greater control over your life, over the decisions that you make, over how you spend your time, over what you do with your time, over where your money goes. So that autonomy can actually be a very attractive pull factor, pulling people out. And again, there are lots of push and pull factors. Those are just two, but I think it's a combination of those. So I don't think it's any one factor that's doing it. Maybe for one individual, they may say like, well, it was really this one thing, and that's probably true for them. But for everybody that we're looking at, it's actually a combination of being pushed out for some reason and being pulled for another reason. I hope that makes sense. And again, I can go into a lot more detail if people have questions about that.
And no, it absolutely does. Do you, from the research that you have done, do you have a sense that this trend will continue, that more and more people will continue identifying as non-religious?
Yeah, that's another really great question. I appreciate it. My initial just kind of knee-jerk reaction is that we're probably closer to the beginning of people leaving religion than to the end. And part of the reason why I say that is the people who left first, right? And they're always going to be like the vanguard, and they're very kind of weird, but the people who are leaving first are kind of like easy to push out and to pull out, right? I think we're starting to move into maybe a little bit of a middle wave where it might be a little bit harder. But one of the things that I always like to point out, and I am much more familiar with US data, though Canadian data is pretty similar, is that even though here in the US, numbers again are similar in the US, about 70% of people say they have a religious affiliation. And in Canada, it's about 65%, 60%, somewhere around there. Even among those 70%, the vast majority of them do not regularly attend religious services. Most of them are not doing religious things on a daily basis. We actually have really good data about this. So what we have are people who are still saying like, oh, I'm Catholic. But then if you ask like, when was the last time you went to a service? So it's like, well, like 4 years ago on Easter, or 6 years ago on Christmas, or something like that. They just don't go. And then if you ask them like, okay, do you agree with the Pope on this or with the Catholic Church on this? Like, well, no, I don't really. Like, I use birth control, right? Like, so they're Catholic in identity, but they're not Catholic in belief or in behavior. And what that suggests to me is that they are on a trajectory out. Right. Now, it could take a long time. We could talk about like it could be generations before the majority of people are non-religious. It didn't take a generation in the UK. The UK is already majority non-religious in terms of affiliation. Australia is getting really close to that. New Zealand is now majority non-religious. Scotland is actually majority non-religious, a substantial majority. So my guess would be that Canada and the US are both on that trajectory. And we have lots of people who still identify as religious, but in terms of their beliefs and practices, they're arguably more like the non-religious than they are like the truly kind of devoted, devout religious. So I would say we're really kind of at the beginning of this process, not at the end. Could that shift? Absolutely. There could be all sorts of things that change that, but I really think we're just at the beginning of this.
For sure, for sure. And certainly the aspect you mentioned of people identifying with a faith community, but not really being connected to it in any material way. That's, I'm sure, something that we're all aware of. And it's interesting that you see that as the beginning of kind of moving away from that at some point.
Yeah, for sure. There's a researcher in Switzerland, Jörg Stolz, who's argued that the first thing that actually goes when people start down this path is actually the behaviors, right? He frames it, I don't love economic terms, but he frames it as behaviors are the most costly part, right? You're spending time. Time is worth something, right? So I don't like putting, value on this, but he's basically saying like you could be doing other things with your time. And so one of the first things that goes when people start to leave religion is the behaviors, because those are costly. The second thing that goes is the beliefs. And the last thing that goes is actually the identity. It's not true everywhere. It's not true for everybody. But the general trend is that it starts with behaviors, moves to beliefs, and then it moves to identity. So the identity is the last part that actually goes.
That's interesting. Janice has a question that relates to this a bit in terms of behavior in the chat. She's wondering, did COVID play a significant role where people couldn't attend services, got used to it, and now just don't bother going back to church?
Another really good question. I appreciate the question. So the initial data that have come out on this, there were a number of researchers who, of course, use this as an opportunity. I haven't seen tons of research, but there have been a few studies that have come out suggest that that is exactly what happened. So it seemed, and this is true whenever there's like a big natural disaster or attack or something like that, there's like a quick uptick in religiosity because you're like, oh, I'm afraid. And like they run back to church or something like that. But that drops off pretty quick. And COVID was a really interesting situation because it kind of forced the closure of a lot of churches. A lot of churches were like, we're just not going to hold services in person. Took some time. There was a lag to get online. But even then, right, like going to church online is pretty comfortable, right? Like you can do it in your pajamas from home on the couch or in bed. And then once the churches open back up, you've now realized like, hey, I had all of that time where I was pretty comfortable. I don't really want to go back. So at least in the US, that's the data that I've seen. I haven't seen any from Canada at this point. The evidence does suggest that COVID actually contributed to this, that people have not gone back to church since the pandemic ended and the churches are back open. There's actually been a pretty substantial drop off in terms of attendance in particular, and identity will eventually follow is the idea. So yeah, I think that's actually a fair point that COVID did speed up the process. I don't think it was going to like reverse anything, change anything. The process was happening. It just sped it up.
Sure. John, is maybe a comment or something you want to say a little bit more about. John mentions that for affirming churches, it's a pull factor. John, do you mean towards churches? Do you want to talk about that a little more?
Thank you. No, my church is an affirming church, and we're building a significant agenda around um, uh, International Day of Pink and Pride and other. We're trying to become a place where um, uh, gay people can feel safe and can come together. And it's part of the principle, it was looking at what's in our neighborhood, and our neighborhood is not um, a high poverty neighborhood. So we're looking for what are the needs in the community, and that's one of the sectors that we're pursuing. So it is, in that sense, it's a push and a pull, while some are pushing away. Um, it's I think that's all I'll say at the moment. Yeah, thanks.
Carol, you wondered if Ryan could speak a bit more to Christian Zionism. Do you want to say a little bit more what you mean by that? Or if Ryan's kind of or if Ryan sort of has a sense. Do you want to talk a little more about that, Carol?
Well, just in terms of, a lot of people seem to be speaking about, being really evangelical in their thinking or their Christian Zionism, which to me seems to be a very warped take on Christianity. So would you call that ultra religious or non-religious? Like, where would that fit? Thanks.
Yeah. Two really interesting questions. So if I can jump back to John's point real quick, and then I'll hit Carol's point. So on John's point, I think he's absolutely right. Like, he's positioned himself, again, I hate to use the economic language, but that it is the language that we often use in sociology when thinking about this. But if we think about religion as a marketplace, people do have the option now to shop. They can shop for churches because this is an elective affinity group, right? You're not forced to go to church. You're not forced to do things. So you can go out and shop. So by positioning his religion as an affirming religion, they do increase the odds of pulling in people who are marginalized by lots of other religions. Here's the tricky part, though. Because it's an elective affinity group, how does it position itself in the marketplace? And increasingly, I think we need to start thinking about religion as not being a marketplace where you just compete against other religions. With religion, you actually compete against all kind of recreational sectors. And I hate to frame religion as recreation, right? But I actually have written a piece where we talk about the NFL, National Football League in the US, competing with churches. So when there are home games on Sundays, attendance actually goes down at local churches. So the reason why I bring that up is, in order for John's church to be effective, what is it about their affirming position that makes them stand out from, say, any other aspect of society, right? What is unique about being an affirming church that is going to make it so people find validation there when they can find that same validation through movies, TV, and other organizations? So it's a tricky issue to kind of try and balance that. So I'm happy to talk more about that. That's a really interesting point. I think it's pretty fascinating to think about. On Carol's point about Christian Zionism, the term that we use here in the US, at least among the sociologists, actually white Christian nationalism, because that tends to be the movement in which it exists. It's a really interesting movement. I wouldn't necessarily call it extreme religion or like ultra religious or ultra devout or anything like that, particularly because it's tied up very closely with politics. And that's what makes it really interesting, is we've actually started to see some strange things happening when it comes to religion and politics in the US, that people are now saying, oh, I support a particular candidate. You can all guess it. I try not to be that political in these talks. I don't know what everybody's politics are, but I support this particular political candidate. That means I'm part of this party. And because I'm on the conservative side, everybody else says that they're Christian, that they're evangelical. Now I have to identify as evangelical, which is super weird. So we always used to think in terms of causal directions, that the religion drove the politics. And now it looks like, at least for some people in the US, the politics is driving the religion, to where if you align with a particular political party, you now feel like you have to identify as Christian. And we're actually seeing with those people, they don't attend, they don't have a home church, they're not regularly attending, they don't actually believe, they don't read anything, but they're adopting the identity because the identity is part of a package that goes with their political views. So it's actually really interesting for a variety of reasons. We could talk about like more details of what's going on with white Christian nationalism. It's a pretty fascinating movement. I think we've got other questions, so maybe I'll stop there, and Emma, you can push us forward on other questions.
Sure. So Pieta had a really interesting question that has some connection to this one, I think, that there's been a statistical upswing in the number of Canadian parents sending their kids to religious schools, Catholic, but also Jewish, Muslim. What do you make of this trend? Is there research in the States that you've looked into that suggests something similar, or what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So we do have, I mean, our system might be different. I know that funding programs are different, and maybe Canada is closer to the UK, where the UK government actually will fund religious schools. In the US, those would be considered private schools. There's mostly a separation between church and state. So we wouldn't have a lot of research on that specifically, though my initial thought would be that this is an affinity thing, that basically they're trying to inculcate more of an identity for their kids. That may not be true for all of them. For some of them, it may just be the quality of the schools. Maybe the schools are better for some reason. But my initial guess is this is parents who are seeing what's going on in secular society, and they're worried. They're genuinely nervous about what's going on, and they're trying to stop that. Because what we know, the research is really, really clear on this, is that, yeah, some people leave religion like later in life, but the vast majority of people who leave religion do it basically in their teens or young adulthood. And it's that transition period. So if you actually plot out like religiosity by generation, the oldest generations are way more religious than the youngest generations. And every generation in between is actually less religious. So I actually argue in some of my research that the mechanism for secularization for people leaving religion is actually the transmission or the failed transmission of religion from parents to kids. So if you have very devout parents who are really worried about this, it would actually make a lot of sense to try and surround them entirely with the religion that they want their kids to grow up with. That would be my initial thought, is that this is really devout people saying, you know what, secular society is really, it's strongly pulling kids. Let me see if I can do something to try and prevent that. That would be my initial thought, but I'd need to think more about it and look into it. It's a great question. It's really, really interesting.
Oh, super interesting. And I know in Ontario, for example, where there are two different school systems, there's a public school system and a Catholic school system. There are many parents who may not themselves really identify with Catholicism, for example, but send their kids to Catholic school. I know many folks do, and there's so many interesting reasons why. But
Yeah.
thank you so much for your insights on that.
Yeah.
I see a couple other questions for Ryan. We do have some time after our event is officially over. No pressure at all to stay, Ryan, but
That's
if
fine.
you would
I'll
like
stay.
to.
Yeah.
Okay, there can be some time to answer those questions then. Thank you so much for your insights and for your time.
My pleasure.
Our next guest is Pieta Woolley, who will be familiar to longtime readers of Broadview. Pieta is a journalist in Powell River. And in our July-August issue, she wrote about the swath of young firefighters who are risking their lives to keep Canadians safe as wildfires grow. And the story she wrote was called Generation Wildfire. Please join me in welcoming Pieta.
Thanks.
Thank you. And feel free, if there is some background from your story that you want to share, some insights that you didn't get a chance to share in your work, feel free to.
For sure. So I'll just talk a little bit about the story. I have my first child graduated from high school this year. He's a boy, and he has been really attracted to the wildfire service, which is not something that I'd ever really paid attention to before. I've done some work around forestry and environmental journalism, but the wildfire service I didn't know anything about. But living in British Columbia, you just can't ignore fires anymore. The last year, 2023, was our most destructive wildfire season on record. And it's been really gearing up for about 6 years. Like each year it's gotten worse and worse and worse and worse. And to the point that some years, I mean, anybody anywhere in Canada probably has similar experiences with just that yellow smoke that will blow into town. And you can't go outside, you can't breathe. It's not normal. This is not normal. Nothing is normal. So I wrote a little bit in my story about just the consciousness that people here, and I'm sure everywhere in Canada, have really had to face since 2021. 2021, we were hit with a heat dome, which we'd never had before, nothing like that. An entire town burned down. Over 600 people died in 3 days, that over and above the number of people who normally die. And then after that, we had atmospheric rivers that fall. So we're like, if you're not a climate change person, we talk about this as weird weather. We're getting a lot of weird weather. And if you are a climate change person, holy Hannah, something's going on that is undeniable. And real people are being really enlisted to adapt to climate change here, these weird weather events, in that they have to either rebuild infrastructure like the Coquihalla Highway that was absolutely decimated, or fight wildfires. And overwhelmingly, the people who are fighting wildfires are young, often Indigenous, often rural, and as a mom, these are all people's kids. These are people's kids who are going into a dangerous situation that has kind of happened out of the blue for us. So in my story, I compare, as many Canadian authors have before me, fighting wildfires to fighting a war. These are kids going off to fight something and putting their bodies in danger. We lost six young wildfire fighters in British Columbia last year. I guess 5, no, 8, I don't remember. A number that's high enough to make mums and dads nervous in British Columbia. And we just haven't seen anything like that before. So I anticipated writing this story. We had a really dry spring, and everybody was looking ahead to the summer like, wow, this is going to be another horrific wildfire season. It hasn't been yet. The rain really picked up. And I have this map. This is a current map of active wildfires in Canada. So you can really see that the active wildfires currently are along the boreal forest. My first journalism job was in the Northwest Territories in Hay River, and I'm sure many of you will remember Hay River was one of those places to watch last year where there was a fire that was right on the border of town, burning underground, flaring up. Local volunteer firefighters responsible for fighting this thing that was just completely out of control for months. And everybody had to leave town, and everybody had to leave Yellowknife too. Like, it's unless you're in these situations, it's the fear, really. I think mounting fear is something that I wanted to get at with my story, not just of the fires, but on the impact on families.
Oh, and you definitely did that. And anyone who has children can certainly, that will certainly resonate with them. I mean, my daughter is very small still, but I felt it. I really felt it when you wrote that. And I mean, that has to have been the experience you had when David was looking at that booth. When you wrote this was before this summer, did he decide to join the wildfire service this year?
No, he did not join the wildfire service this year, which I'm really happy about. But many of my peers have children who are in it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's such a tragedy to the growth of wildfire and the urgency of it, and just the fact that young people are the ones that are putting themselves forward for this. Philomena Yale, whose daughter died last year, you talked to her a little bit about why Devon went and fought fires and why it appealed to her other children as well. And she said something really interesting, which is that she doesn't think of them as soldiers. What would be your take on these young people going out to fight
For sure.
fires?
Well, I mean, like, oh geez. It is, if you take away the idea that people get hurt and die, what an incredible job it is, because it's an adventure. You're in the forest, you're using your body, you're using your brain, you're in a team of people who are really dedicated to doing something absolutely necessary that they can feel so proud of. The pay is pretty good. You can count on fires every summer, so you have a job at the end of your university year or college year or whatever you're doing. And like, man, like, would you rather fight a wildfire or would you rather work at Tim Hortons if you're 19 years
Yeah.
old? I mean, to me, that's pretty obvious. Like, if you just take away the death part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
It's really exciting. And there are really not very many jobs that are like that for young people right now. Like, to be a young person right now, what are you doing? If you're really lucky, you can be a day camp leader. That's pretty good. You can be a lifeguard. But that call to arms to do something really critical for the world, that is so reserved, it seems, when you're a kid. It seems like that's something that you do when you're 40 or 50 or 60 years old. It does not feel like something that's available to you when you're 17 or 19.
Absolutely. Mary has a question. She's wondering what benefits follow those firefighters, as not all of the impacts are current given the effect of smoke and injuries that can happen. Do you want to speak to that a bit?
It's a great question that I don't have an answer to. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's I'm sure there are impacts later on. In Powell River right now, I know the fire season right now has not been anywhere near as bad as it has been in past years. But in the last few years that you've lived there, what was the situation like? Did your friends that whose children went off to fight fire, did the fire follow them back home as well? What was the situation in Powell River?
Yeah, it's a good question. We're in coastal British Columbia, and the fires that happen here typically, because like the trees are huge, so typically like in Fort McMurray or the boreal forest, like on this chart, fires travel really well when the trees are small and dry like that, and the wind can blow and kind of blow through a bunch of fuel. So the heat, the dryness, and the fuel have to come together to make that happen. So on the whole West Coast, where you have these big, typically wet Douglas firs and cedars, we can get a lot of spot fires. So in Powell River, that's been the situation, is there's been spot fires that flare up where there's been like clear cut situations. So a forestry company will take down trees and there will be piles of slash, and when those get really hot because they're not shaded by the tree canopy, they can flare up into a fire. But they're also relatively easy to contain, because trying to light a 200-year-old Douglas fir on fire is like, that's a challenge even for a fire. So we don't get the same kind of fires here typically as you would in the interior of British Columbia or elsewhere. But we certainly, I mean, we do get fires, but it's not the same as elsewhere.
Yeah.
Though, and I mean, our young firefighters don't stay here to fight fires. Typically they go to where they're needed.
the young firefighters who are going to deal with this clearly feel that this is an urgent issue and they want to offer themselves up somehow to fight it. But there's a large systemic effort here, I think. And we know that there are larger reasons why these are becoming more intense. But is there anything you think that the BC government could be doing differently to cope with the scale of this problem?
It's a great question. And it's like, there's kind of two answers to that. One of them is like locally, there's just things like in my story, there was a representative from the forest industry who said, we really just need to be doing a better job of taking care of things like fuel slash piles, which are such an obvious ignition. And we do need like trained forces of people who are ready to go out and fight fires, and like just stuff like that, stuff that's like, this is a situation that's happening, let's deal with it like this. But in terms of like the whole world getting hotter and drier, that's not I don't know. This is climate politics that I am really not the best person to speak to. Obviously there's things that we can do in British Columbia to reduce our climate impacts, but man, it takes a national effort, it takes an international effort, and everybody I talk to for this story just frankly doesn't think that that's happening with any kind of speed or gravity that it needs to in order to actually make an impact on what's happening on the ground in British Columbia or anywhere else in Canada.
BC's really being hit hard lately with a bevy of disasters. A question in the chat that's on a bit of a different note. Wondering, do you think that the excitement of video games, which are violent in nature, may be attractive to young people as they're immune to the reality of death and danger in real life perilous situations?
Yeah, like totally. But I look backwards too at like every other generation that's had a call to do something dangerous. And I was just at the Canadian Air Force Museum in Comox a couple of weeks ago, over on the island, and looking at some of those posters from World War II that were like recruitment posters for 19-year-old guys. Like they don't think they're gonna die. Like death, that's not a video game thing. That's just a 19-year-old thing. Like, man, they think they're gonna live forever and they think they can do anything, and they don't want to take anybody's advice, and they know everything. So I mean, the flip side of this is, yes, we have totally removed death from their lives. They have like, how many 19-year-olds have actually seen a dead body or contemplated that young people have the ability to die? Like, if they have seen someone dead, that person is old. They don't think that applies to them. But I honestly don't think that's a this generation thing. I think that's a 19-year-old thing.
One more question that's kind of on that safety note. One last question here from Janice. How much training, if you have any understanding of this, how much training and safety protection is provided to the firefighters? The TV show Fire Country portrays the job as exciting, and maybe that reflects some risk taking that goes beyond common sense. So Janice says.
It's a great question. I don't totally know it. I know that I can, if I'm a kid, I can join the fire service in the spring and I can be fighting fires by the summer. So what happens in those 2 or 3 months, that's your training. How much training is necessary? I don't know. How much common sense is necessary? Probably a lot. You know, I don't know. Could training take care of the risk? That's not a question that I can answer. Would putting older people who are more risk averse into those roles instead of young people cut down on the number of injuries? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and just such an interesting phenomenon that, as you mentioned, that young people are are channeling their energy into fighting this right now. It's such a fascinating story, incredibly emotional, and thank you so much for sharing it with us. And if there are other questions that we didn't get a chance to answer, or if folks want to chat with you a little bit more about the story, if you'd like to stick around after the event, you're welcome to as well. Thank you so much,
thank you.
Pieta.
Thanks.
We're going to move to our final guest, who's also looking at larger systemic issues in this country, Sam Dunsiger. Samuel is an Ottawa-based freelance writer, career advisor, and accessibility advocate who identifies as disabled. He wrote Beyond Ramps in our July-August issue about how far Canada still has to go on accessibility. Thanks so much for being here, Sam.
Thank you, Emma. Yeah, so I guess to start with like a little bit of context, as Emma said, like I both identify as disabled. I have a disability, and I've worked as an accessibility consultant as well, and so in that regard, I've worked with different public and private sector organizations across Canada in their compliance with AODA and as well as the ACA and then the Accessible Canada Act. And so the piece that I wrote really blends together like both my professional and personal experiences, and then I guess like what I found, simply put, is that we're really society, I mean, like we're really like not as accessible as we think we are, and there's there's really a discrepancy between like businesses and public spaces that say that they're accessible and like they may have like installed a ramp at like the entrance or like an automatic door opener, but in reality they're not, but in reality they're more inaccessible than accessible. So to illustrate this point, like I kicked off the story with a brief anecdote of one of my one of my favorite coffee shops in Toronto and before I moved to Ottawa. And if you walk by it, you'll see that like they have a ramp going up, and you might think, okay, great, that these guys are accessible. But then like once you walk up the ramp, you realize there's no automatic door opener. And if you even make it inside, the washrooms are not accessible at all. The washrooms are located at the back down this really long and narrow staircase. So I share this little anecdote to really emphasize that discrepancy. And and I know that Emma had asked a guiding question in terms of why write this story now? And so, like, to share some additional context, there was recently research done last year from Access Now, which is a Canadian accessibility technology company. And the research is considered the largest accessibility study of its kind in Canada. And it did find that 60% of spaces in major urban cities are considered inaccessible. So it goes to show that there really is a discrepancy between businesses that in spaces that like say that they're accessible, but in reality they're not quite.
Yeah. And I know I live in Toronto, and there are so many older buildings, that it almost seems like there wasn't much consideration given to accessibility. As you said, there might be a ramp at the front door, but the bathroom is in the basement. And so it's, it's going to be impossible for so many people to use it. The Accessible Canada Act, which is the piece of legislation that you spoke about in the piece, what is your sense of the, you mentioned that we still haven't made a lot of progress on it. Is it meant to cover all aspects of accessibility, like visual and audio accessibility? Sort of how far does it aim to go, if that makes any sense?
It does. So the Accessible Canada Act includes some standards in terms of what areas of accessibility to cover, and it's not just the physical space or the built environment, but the digital accessibility, so websites and social media, or customer service, and then non-digital communication, so any sort of documents or written communication. And even employment as well, so our job postings accessible or inclusive of people with disabilities. But part of the problem with the Accessible Canada Act, for instance, is that while these broad standards exist, there's no specific checklist for people to follow in terms of here's how you make something accessible.
Are there things that you can think of that would help make implementing some of those standards easier for businesses, for organizations?
Yeah, so I feel like the biggest thing is like consulting with or including like people with disabilities into the process, because like there's a common saying like in the disability community, um I think that's along the lines of like nothing about us without us. And so like basically like what that means is any accessibility, pretty much like any accessibility work needs to include people with disabilities who are actually facing like these barriers in the first place. Because I mean, like part of the problem is that like I feel like there's a real like systemic misconception as to like what accessibility is. Like I go back to like the example of like ramps and like automatic door openers, because like I think people perceive that accessibility is literally like just a ramp. Like that's part of the issue. Like a lot of businesses have the mindset of like, okay, like we've installed a ramp, our place is now accessible, we're done. But accessibility is a lot more nuanced than that. And again, like people with like even like the same disabilities experience like wildly like different barriers. And I can get into like naming like what some of them are, but we'd be here forever though. And so at the end of the day, like we really need to integrate the voices like of people with disabilities and like incorporate like their lived experiences like into making things more accessible.
Absolutely. I know when you spoke about like accessibility standards on websites, for example, like I know there are ways that our Broadview website, I know there are ways that we need to improve accessibility. Visually, having access to screen readers, there are things that I know that we need to do. And I imagine there are so many other organizations that need to improve that as well. There are a couple questions in the chat, but I wanted to ask you something that you mentioned in the piece, which is that the scale of the problem, the need for improved accessibility might grow in the coming years as more and more people get older in Canada and more people begin identifying as disabled. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, like that's definitely like an issue, like especially as like the population ages. Like I like to like I often like to describe like disability as something that's like very fluid. Like in other words, like in the past, like disability has like often been seen as like a binary concept, like you're either disabled or like you're able-bodied, like end of story. But like nowadays I feel like there has been like better like understanding that disability, it is like a very like fluid personal thing. And like, and especially like as people as people get older and then like their body changes, or like their mind changes, like disabilities, like they can flare up, they can, like they can rear like their ugly head in like certain situations. I think in one of the versions of my piece, like I mentioned the fact, I mention a reference to my father who's in his late 70s, and he's never and like for like the majority of his life, like he's never considered himself like to be like disabled, never really experienced an accessibility. But like now that he's getting older, he started to experience some like mobility issues. He now uses a walker, and so like nowadays, and like he even like tells me like sometimes that he's experienced tons of barriers like navigating Toronto that he's never experienced at like any point in his life.
Yeah. As Mary Elizabeth mentioned that in the chat, but that insight that disability is something fluid that's a really interesting point. We have time for one more question. There's one in the chat from Beryl. Beryl's wondering, with respect to church communities, do you think that easier access to government grants to refit buildings adequately would make a big difference in better accessibility?
I think so. Yeah, because like I feel like part of the problem is that like I'm not sure this totally answers the question, but like especially like olderly building codes didn't include accessibility at all. So I feel like those like would definitely like need to be like retrofitted.
There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and there are few people sharing comments about their own communities, and I'm sure there are many spaces where this could improve. There is some time afterwards, so Sam, if you want to stick around, there are folks that still have some questions and insights. We can share them then. But we're going to wrap up the formal portion of this evening. Sam, thanks so much for being here and for sharing with us. That brings us to the end of our program. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. As I mentioned, there are docs to be on, although some of you may be on one right now. Thank you especially to Ryan, Pieta, and Sam, who volunteered their time to make this event possible. We're very grateful to all three of you. As I mentioned, there will be an informal time for questions and discussion afterwards. This will also be a time, if there were other stories from the July-August issue that you want to chat about, we can do that then. Tomorrow, we'll also be sending you a short survey by email so you can share your thoughts with us about this event. Broadview's National Online Reading Club is free, but it does cost money to hire the great contributors to our publication. So if you're already a donor to Broadview, thank you so much. Your donations help Broadview continue to feature exceptional people like Ryan and hire amazing people like Pieta and Sam. If you're not a donor, please consider making a small donation for tonight's event. Aisha will post a link for donations in the chat, and we'll also include a link with tomorrow's survey. Otherwise, thank you so much for being here. Be well, and hope to see you back here on September 9th when we'll host a discussion about our September issue. Good night, everyone.